There were 26 women who helped author the book, A Rumbling of Women, Napa Feminists, 1970 to 1990. So there are four of us here. Lauren Coodley will start the program. Then Charlene Steen will speak. Then Jan Svoboda, and I will wrap up. Enjoy.
Okay, so I came to Napa in 1975. I was invited to teach the first women's studies course at Napa College in that fall. And I actually started driving up from Berkeley, where I was finishing my master's degree. And I taught psychology of women, which I believe was the first time it had been taught as a credit course in a trailer in St. Helena that first spring. I started teaching 2 weeks after I was hired. I came to Napa because I believe I was hired because I was an unknown. There was a group of very effective and assertive women who had been pressuring the college to have women's studies, to have childcare, to have a reentry program, and they were perceived as too threatening, I believe. It took me many years to figure that out, but they gave me the job of being the first women's studies teacher, and I was basically an immigrant from, graduate school, still in graduate school, and I had never lived in Napa. So I moved here, and what I found was an organized and intense community of women who'd been meeting at the Napa Women's Center since 1972. They'd been doing feminist activism for 3 years, at least, if not more. And I began teaching the students who were really about my age, and I looked at what needed to be done in Napa. One of the most immediate needs we thought was to form an emergency phone line for victims of rape and what we then called wife beating or battery. So we formed a hotline. We got some kind of minimal training, and we took the calls in our own homes and counseled women. Some of the women in the group were themselves being battered, but we didn't necessarily know that at the time. We also made slideshows on the links between pornography and advertising, and traveled around and shows those slideshows along with Lois Engel, who had a fantastic slideshow on sexism in children's literature. So although I was teaching, I was also basically part of a community that was very active in trying to find new ways for women to express ourselves, advocate for ourselves, find equality. And eventually, after signatures were collected at a shopping center, the first women's shelter was set up in 1981. Then I would say a new period began in the 80s, where we focused on bringing women's history to schools. We got costumes, we developed scripts, we had students go to schools all over Napa and play women in history. It was fantastically successful and very, very popular. I myself wrote plays on Joliet Lowe's life, Susan B. Anthony's life, which were produced for Girl Scouts and elementary schools. And I also participated in programs to promote girls in math and science, which led me to specialize in how to teach math to girls and women. In the 90s, the Commission on the Status of Women was discontinued in Napa. Women's studies classes were largely removed from the curriculum at the college. Only a few full-time teachers were left teaching women's studies. I do remember that one of those semesters in the 90s, I taught women's history in the trailer that housed Sudie's teen parent program. We read about how colonial women put out warnings on trees about untrustworthy men. I'll never forget the enthusiasm with which Sudie's students wrote their own warnings about the men in their lives. Women's studies in those days was very personal and direct. It was not academic. It was based on the testimony of women, oral history, memoir, biography. Students researched the mothers and grandmothers in their own lives, learned to do crafts like women had done traditionally. I returned to grad school in 1995 to get a formal degree in history because I felt that the men at the college had never taken me seriously as a historian because I didn't have a degree in history, and I was just given the opportunity to develop women's history without it. I was assured by the administrators at the college that I would be able to teach history if I got a master's. However, my direct supervisor denied me classes for the next 2 years. A group of women that included Sudie met at Virginia Norton's house to plan how to pressure the college. And after much work, were eventually successful. For the next dozen years, I taught US, California, and Napa history and integrated women into the narrative. I expanded women's history to meet multiple requirements, and it was taught by me and others to hundreds of young men and women. I also wrote books that integrated women into history. When I retired, I was not replaced by a teacher of women's history. The course no longer meets requirements. The course on overcoming math anxiety was deemed no longer necessary. The one domestic shelter house is always full with a waiting list. After Virginia Norton died, she had been the first manager of the Napa Women's Shelter. We began to meet at Sudie's house to plan how to memorialize the work we had done in the 70s and 80s. And those meetings resulted in a rumbling of women and our collaboration with the Historical Society. For many, many years, Sudie and I had expressed to each other that this extraordinary period in Napa history of activism for women by women needed to be recognized in some way. And we were just determined that we would finally figure out a way to do it. And I suggested that we work with the Historical Society. Nancy Levenberg was very gracious and encouraged us. We hired somebody to do interviews with the women who didn't necessarily want to write their own story. So some women were interviewed and some women wrote their own story. And I feel like there's a lot there that has never been told, and just as much as there is still not there. One of the challenges of this kind of memoir writing is that sometimes it can be, it's very challenging to fuse the personal and political. It's very challenging to remember what was going on in society at the same time as we were doing our own thing. So if I were to write a second volume or a revised edition, it would be more integrated with, say, the end of the ERA and how we marked and mourned the end of the ERA. I think we could have integrated the wider society a little bit more, the beginning of Title IX. But we were engaged in telling each our own story, as I've done tonight. So I just would add that there's a lot more to say about what happened between 1970 and 1990 in Napa for feminism. But we sure made a start, and that was our dream. So it happened, and I think we're celebrating that tonight.
I'm Charlene Steen, and I'm 85 years old. And when I was born, women had only had the right to vote for 16 years, which is pretty horrifying when we think about it. I think I was always a feminist. I was fascinated with women's suffrage when I was a kid. And I read biographies of all the famous suffragists at that time. At that time, we called them suffragettes, by the way. But I thought, oh my goodness, all of this work has been done. There's nothing more to do, until I became an adolescent and began to think about what I was going to do in life. And I began to look around and saw that there were no women in most professions. No women were allowed in any professional orchestras. No women were newscasters. No women were in trades. There were no women in police forces as police officers or firefighters. There weren't top executives in big companies who were women. Women generally became teachers, secretaries, nurses, waitresses only in the cheap restaurants. In the expensive, high flow restaurants, they only had men waiters. And of course, house cleaners. When I went to college, I was expected to get married and have children and become one of the accepted professions, and I did. I became a teacher, and I married a doctor and had 3 children. Well, after 3 children, I wanted to have my tubes tied, so I went to the doctor and hospital, and they said, your husband has to sign for you. I said, what do you mean my husband has to sign for me? It's my body. Why does someone have to sign for my body? Well, they put me under, tied my tubes, and had my husband sign while I was under the anesthesia. I was so mad when the procedure was finished. It was also a sad time for abortion. My husband had worked at LA County Hospital and seen daily, they saw women who came in dying from self-aborting with clothes hangers and every other type of gadget. It was really awful. A friend of mine needed an abortion. And since my husband was a doctor, she asked if we knew anybody. We referred her to a doctor, who referred her to a doctor, who referred her to somebody else, all kind of secretively. And she finally got to somebody who did the abortion in a garage in a crummy area of town. And luckily she survived, but it was a pretty horrifying, traumatic experience. I was very disturbed as a young woman about all of these things, but there wasn't much I could do about it until the late 60s, when all of a sudden the women's movement began to burst forth. And I got together, at this time I lived in Southern California. So I got together with 4 friends and we started a mutual support and advocacy group. We ran consciousness raising groups in all of our homes. We started a women's center with a library and childcare so women could go out and get educations or work. The original group, however, kind of self-destructed. 2 of us became attorneys. One became the first newscaster, female newscaster in Los Angeles. And one wrote a book on feminism and traveled around the country publicizing it. As an attorney, I might add, whenever I was in the courthouse with a man who was a client, it was assumed that the man was the attorney and I was either the secretary or the client. And I was always having to tell them, no, 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 I'm the attorney. Well, I came to Napa in 1977. And when I came here, there were only a handful of attorneys in Napa. I was the only attorney in Yountville, not only the only woman attorney, the only attorney in Yountville. I don't know whether there are any more now. And as an attorney in Napa, I had a very diverse practice that had a lot of work for women as well. I represented the first woman on the Napa police force who had a discrimination case. I represented a female firefighter who couldn't get a job in Napa because we had no female firefighters. And so she got a job with the state. She was lucky. I also did free restraining orders for battered women. So every Friday I'd be writing away until about midnight doing restraining orders to try to keep men away from, well, it was Thursday night for Fridays, to save women from being battered. I was also very active in the Women's Political Caucus, which was a very lively group at that time that was fighting for rights and things for women. I taught, as part of the Women's Reentry Program, I taught a class on women and the law. And I basically taught women their rights, their responsibilities. And I'm pleased to see, and every once in a while, I run into one of the women who were in my class and see what they've done with their lives, and it's wonderful. At that time, as Lauren mentioned, we had a Napa County Commission on the Status of Women with a big budget of $300, by the way. And we did a lot of different programs. I think the ones I remember the most, we did programs in high schools on non-traditional jobs, where we got women who were plumbers and engineers and doctors and lawyers, all different kinds of jobs, so that women could see that they had choices. We also started a support group for battered women in Napa County. And we also really got the ball rolling on the women's shelter, which had been they've been limping along trying to get a shelter. And some of the members of our commission, and Gail O'Kelly particularly, really pushed it forward so the county would support it and fund it at first. Let's see, what else did we do? Well, at that time, I think I decided I didn't want to be a lawyer anymore. So I went back and got my master's degree in social work, and was under that, I got the ball rolling for sexual assault victim services in Napa, SAVS. And what we did is give a lot of support to women who were to children who were sexually abused, women who were raped, and so on. But I decided I wanted to go on for my PhD in psychology, so I left that in good hands, since it's still going, and went back, became a psychologist. And as a psychologist, although my main interest was criminal psychology, I worked for Solano County, and I also had a private practice in Napa. And I ran self-actualization groups for women in Solano County and in Napa in my private practice, where women could come and develop themselves. I also wrote the only book for adult female sex offenders, and there are many of them. The majority of them offend in concert with a man, and 87% of the cases where it's a joint offense, the man was the one who basically ordered the woman to commit the offenses. Well, now I'm relaxing, but I thought of one more thing. Also, the name of my book is Choices, because I think that's the essence of the women's movement. I'm very saddened now, though, to see things go backwards, where women no longer have as much choice in many states, particularly over their own bodies. It's just like when I was a kid and I thought everything had been accomplished. I thought everything was accomplished now, women were moving up. But now I see that we're at a crossroads where we really have to get going again and do something now. Thank you.
Jan Svoboda, and I moved to Napa back in 1973 after graduating from the University of Oregon. I'm a baby boomer born in 1949. And in 1968, when I turned 19, I set out for my first exciting solo adventure to attend college in a different state of Oregon, 900 miles away from home. I ventured out of state because I just wanted to view the world a little differently than I had growing up in a small little town near Palm Springs, Southern California. When I went to U of O, it was buzzing with progressive energy, and it was in 1968, a very important year in our history. I was drawn to classmates and professors who were actively questioning why our country was fighting in Vietnam, in a land that claimed all citizens were created equal. Why was there so much inequality and discrimination against women? Why did people of color have to sit in the back of the bus and have to fight for their constitutional rights? It was 1968. When young women were starting to burn bras and demand equality, when young men were burning their draft cards. College students throughout the United States were demonstrating for peace, and with some being shot by the National Guard. This was the year that Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were both shot and killed because of what they stood for. So as a college student, I was learning that the United States of America was not the country I was raised and taught that it was. I graduated from U of O, and where did I go from there? I came to Napa, 1972. I was looking for a job, something to do with meaning, and I applied for a job with Napa County Council for Economic Opportunity. It was called NCCEO. The agency's director was Esperanza Hope Lugo, and she interviewed me. What I remember most about the interview, which was 50 years ago, was how strong Hope spoke and how she was so committed to, and how much she loved the immigrants of Napa Valley, and how much she wanted to help the poor community of the Valley. She herself had been a migrant worker, and now she was executive director of NCCEO. She was the strongest woman I had ever met in my life. She hired me as a community worker, and I became a community worker who worked for the betterment of the lives of the migrant families of the Valley. We spent time looking for low-income housing, talking to the city council about building more housing. We raised money for the farm worker union. We picketed for the farm workers. We marched for the farm workers. We worked for, we took care of single mothers who were looking for a house with their 3 kids. It was really setting me up to make connections to the community of Napa, and set me up to meet like-minded people. And so I would go to fundraisers, and I'd meet someone like Sudie. I was going to the school board meetings, and I was meeting Lois Engel. As I was being active, I was connecting with other active women. It was a natural income or a natural outcome of just being involved. We started doing a lot of potlucks back then. Just getting together and talking about the politics of the local community, what was going on in the schools, what was going on with the police force, what was going on everywhere. There was a school called Silver Pony that was really of interest to me. I visited often, and I got to meet teachers and the families there, and I just started falling in love with being with kids. As the momentum kept growing and growing, we decided that we would have a big meeting over at Lois Engel's house and establish some kind of goals and establish what was really important to us. And so we put up chart paper all over the walls and started writing down what our purpose was. We decided that we really needed to have a meeting place, an actual physical meeting place, so that everyone could meet together and be a hub for our political interests, for social interests, for educational interests. And after that meeting, it seemed like that's exactly what happened. I'm not sure where the money came from. I know I gave what I could, and I know others gave what they could, but I really I forget right now how we started paying monthly for a storefront on 3rd Street, a block away from Jefferson Street. And that was established as the Napa Valley Women's Center. So my life changed when I got hired as an elementary teacher. I got hired in 1976, and I had a 30-year career with the district. I taught at Carneros, I taught at Westwood, which is now NVLA, and Browns Valley and El Centro. And my whole feminist view really came very clear when I was given textbooks for my 3rd and 4th graders. I was supposed to cover some history of California, and the history books never mentioned any women. They never mentioned who populated the state or the country before Europeans came over. And it just it was like going back in time after going to college and being so progressive. So it wasn't too much time when I connected with Lois, and I connected with a number of other teachers, and we started going to San Francisco to Old Wives' Tales bookstore that specialized in feminist literature and feminist children's books. There was also several places in Berkeley, and I started bringing books into my classroom that were different, that actually did have girls as active problem solvers. I remember one book called The Dragon and the Doctor. It was like a simple picture book, and my 5th and 6th graders would take it to the 1st grade class, and they had reading buddies, and they would read these picture books to these 1st graders, and they'd come back with so many wonderful stories about how those little buddies just loved their dragon with a sore tail, and the woman doctor took care of that dragon. So we spent a lot, teachers that were wanting to change the curriculum or change the resources available for students. We really formed a really close-knit group, and we exchanged our curriculum ideas. We learned about books like Island of the Blue Dolphins, Julie of the Wolves, and we watched our girls just get so excited that they wanted to put on plays and be Julie. Back in 1980, I began to teach over at Westwood School, which was becoming a very highly populated Hispanic school. And it really motivated me because of how Hispanics were not, they weren't presented in the history books at all. So I joined the district textbook review team, and it was a wonderful experience. I was on it for years. And our mission was to review potential textbooks to be adopted by the school district. At that point in time, there was one state who ended up having so much clout with the publishers, and it was Texas. So national textbooks that were okayed in Texas ended up spreading all over the country. And I'm not sure still to this day, what the connection was, except there were a lot of publishing companies who were housed in Texas and they got adopted. I only got started in terms of how education changed so much, but because of the women's movement, it motivated me to be a much better teacher and a much better person overall myself. So I'm so grateful for my experience back in the 70s and 80s with these beautiful women, and I have much gratitude.
All of you have brought up so many wonderful memories for me. Am I online? I hope so.
Yes, you are.
It was 1964. 1964, I graduated from Napa High School, and 4 years later from UC Davis. I got married and got divorced within a year, earned a teaching credential, returned to Napa in 1971, and I was hired to be the first teacher for the new pregnant minor program created to meet the needs of pregnant and parenting teens. I was the teacher director for that program for 30 years. My students taught me so much about resiliency in the face of rape, incest, fetuses who die before they're born, mothers who give birth to dead babies, crib death, dysfunctional families, special needs children, divorce and child custody, immigration, and discrimination. Linda Thomas started COPE in 1972, and I was her assistant director, and I spent every Friday night for several years on that 24-hour hotline. As I learned active listening techniques from COPE trainers, I taught those to my students so that they might have tools to defuse an angry person in their life. As I learned more about positive parenting, I shared that information with my young mothers. It was my mission to improve the educational opportunities of these young women because during my senior year at Napa High, my best friend Kathy was summarily dismissed from school because she was pregnant and therefore guilty of carnal knowledge. I taught women's history to my pregnant students because how could I not? These girls needed to understand patriarchy and its effect on them. They lived it every day, separated from their peers, with their boyfriends still at regular high school and still on their sports teams. They needed to know about Sacagawea, who led Lewis and Clark to the Pacific Ocean. She was 14 years old and pregnant by her husband, Charbonneau, who had won her in a card game. She gave birth in the Dakota Territories and continued to walk west with a baby on her back. William Clark nicknamed her baby Pomp, and everybody survived the trip. But she showed my students that teen women can be strong. I became a member of the Napa Valley Women's Center, not the one that is currently located next door to Planned Parenthood on Jefferson Street and is an anti-abortion establishment. Our Women's Center on 3rd Street was full, like Jan said, of radical feminist women who celebrated March, Women's History Month, with women's bands, women-only dances, poetry readings, plays, educational forums. We worked within the school district to have women dressed in historical costumes, which was just wonderful. I can still see Louise Erickson, her long hair in braids, sporting a fringed outfit with a rifle in her hand. Oh, she was Annie Oakley in person. Professional actors took the district auditorium stage for high school students to see and hear stories of strong women who made important contributions to culture. And we helped school librarians select books that supported the truth about women. I remember that curriculum committee, Jan, previewing those books, and they were all from Texas. And I always looked in the index, and the word women was never in the index. When I pointed that out to other members of the committee, those books never made it into Napa schools. And I told my students about that so that they would understand the system of patriarchy. I shared with my students what I learned from the women at the Napa Valley Women's Center, people like Lois Engel, who's been mentioned so many times, who developed a slideshow with pictures from first grade early reader books, along with stories about little boy Dick, who worked helping dad outside building things, while little girl Jane hung around and watched, or played with the dog, or brought them lemonade. My students saw the sexism in those stories, and they wrote new stories. Lynn Tebow, Anna Kołakowska, and I were on the committee to convince Napa College to provide childcare. I can still remember the male administrator who said, "Children didn't belong on a college campus." Well, I told my students about that, and they wrote a letter explaining that they would really like to attend college, but since they did have children, they would need childcare. Eventually, the chrysalis tended to hundreds of children. Every year, I took my students on a tour of Napa Valley College, showing them the bookstore, the cafeteria, the admissions office, and the women's reentry program, which addressed the specific needs of women. Class offerings included overcoming math anxiety, women's history, assertiveness training, psychology of women, self-defense, women and the law, and so many more. And sadly, that program no longer exists. Birth control and reproductive rights became an interest of mine. I developed classroom presentations about how each birth control method works, but more importantly, why it fails. I was selected to be a mentor teacher in the school district for 5 years in a row, so I could be a guest speaker in other classrooms. My favorite topics were the realities of teen pregnancy, labor and delivery with charts and movies, birth control, and sexually transmitted diseases, complete with poster-sized photographs of diseased genitalia. Oh yes, parental permission was required. I am one of many local people responsible for bringing Planned Parenthood to Napa. Even though I had a secondary teaching credential and an administrative credential, the situations I faced at the Hill and Valley Teen Parent Program were way beyond the norm. So I went to graduate school nights, weekends, and summers to earn a master's degree in marriage, family, child counseling. I opened a private practice, and I was able to help even more women and children who were victims of crimes usually committed by men. I retired in 2002, and the school for girls I created is no more. My students have done amazing things. In addition to rearing children, some became teachers and attorneys, executive secretaries, registered nurses, medical assistants, hairstylists, journeyman carpenters, police dispatchers, social workers, psychologists, accountants, business owners, and yes, some earned degrees in women's studies. I spoke with a former student this month who called to tell me that she's receiving her bachelor's degree in May. She's majoring in ethnic studies with a minor in women's studies, and she's turning 60. My friend Kathy, who was expelled from Napa High School in 1964, has a master's degree in social work. She's in Reno, working with dialysis patients. You just can't keep a determined woman down. I'd like to leave you with a song written by Jody Eliason, entitled Girl Child Gone. To me, it's the story of patriarchy's effect on women in 4 verses. Master, your child is born. Tell me, where does your pleasure lie? Is it a son? No, sire, it's a daughter. Then leave it outside to die. Hey, lo, lo, who's gonna know? It's only a girl child gone. Hey, there, who's gonna care? It's only a girl child gone. Constable, that woman told me she was free to do as she willed. She's a threat to the church. She's a threat to the state. She's a witch. She must be killed. Hey, lo, lo, who's gonna know that 9 million women died? Hey, there, who's gonna care that 9 million women died? That girl who was raped and shot last night, if they go out, they've got to pay. She was too good looking. She got what she deserved. She probably liked it anyway. Hey, lo, lo, who's gonna know? It's only a woman gone. Hey, there, who's gonna care? It's only a woman gone. Let's make abortion illegal. With life, we must not toy. She's not as important as that bundle of cells, and besides, it might be a boy. Hey, lo, lo, who's gonna know if today 50 women died? Hey, there, who's gonna care if today 50 women die?
Thank you, Sudie.
Thank you, Sudie. That's really lovely. Thank you all. Thank you, Lauren, Charlene, Jan, and Sudie. Thank you very, very much for sharing your stories. What wonderful and courageous women you have been throughout your lives. You've done some remarkable things here in this valley and among the whole county. And for the women, I know that I speak in behalf of many, many women that you all have touched, thousands probably, that they are all for the better of it. Are there any questions that any of you have in the audience that you'd like to ask? If you do, please type them into the chat and then we will ask. And while we're waiting for you to type them in, I have a question for Charlene. You said you were born 16 years after suffrage was enacted in 1924. So how did your mom, was your mother a very pro-suffrage woman? I mean, how did she react to that?
Actually, it was my father who was really much more of a feminist than my mother. My mother was very traditional. And my father warned my husband when he married me that if he expected me just to be a housewife, he'd be very disappointed. He was shocked, if nothing else. But I remember asking my mother why women weren't newscasters. And her answer to that was, women's voices are too high. You know, she just made excuses for everything. She sort of went along with the flow.
Yeah. Wow. Well, so we do have a question for y'all. I don't know that it's to anyone particular, but anyone who wants to take it on. The question comes from Lynn, and she's asking, where do women in Napa begin today to carry on this important movement that you all have pointed out, I think is at a moment, a watershed moment in this country where we could take some major steps backwards. So where do you go today in Napa to begin to carry the movement on?
Women need to start back where we were in 1972 and 3. It's to organize. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have, we had telephones back then. So I think the younger women need to do exactly what they're doing, which is organizing, and vote, vote, vote. It's so important to get involved in politics.
And we have to support organizations.
Anybody else speak to that?
Yeah, we have to, I think, support organizations like Emerge, which trains women to go into politics. We have to go to whenever, we recently, well, just before COVID, we had a big rally against the oppressive abortion laws that were being passed right here in Napa. I was there. But I think the younger women have to take over now, certainly for me.
Can I speak to that question? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm still extremely haunted by the fact that we started this hotline for victims of what we called wife beating back then, or battered women. And it's unbelievably still not only a crisis, but more women are being murdered every year than were murdered back when we began this little volunteer hotline. I cannot believe that batterers are allowed to stay in their homes and women and children are forced to leave. I cannot believe that abusers and stalkers are given hardly any jail time, and women who are threatened are basically, the best thing they can do is get a new identity and leave their homes, their states. So I feel like if I was going to start over, I was to tell women where to start. It's that we are living in a huge crisis around what I refuse to call domestic violence. It is not domestic at all. And it's an epidemic. The new language for it is toxic masculinity. But the solution will have to be developed, but it certainly can no longer be women going to one house in Napa that has a waiting list. It can't be that anymore, and yet it still is.
I have to add one word to this. We keep talking about longer and longer prison terms, and we keep people locked up longer than anywhere in the world. We have more people locked up, but we don't have any rehabilitation. We don't have any treatment. Treatment with sex offenders does work, and there are statistics that show it. If we want to stop violence against women, we have to treat the offenders. You can't just lock them up. They come out and they do the same thing again. The Marin women, I don't know, it's a shelter group there for women who are battered, have been doing stuff like that. Which is very good. And they've joined with the people, I treated the offenders, and they have been joining with people who are treatment and supporting treatment rather than just, locking people up, letting them out and letting them just, start all over again.
I'd like to add something. I don't live in Napa anymore, but I live close. But I'm really concerned about this new power group trying to ban books in libraries. And the books that they are targeting are books that have to do with diversity and history books about slaves and history books about the witches that were burned. There's a group of people nationally who kind of want to whitewash history and have it go back to the 1940s and 30s. So that's, if I was, I think that's something that's really important to deal with.
Thank you, ladies. Absolutely. I think everything you've brought up, rehabilitation, there's some remarkable rehabilitation programs that I have seen. And I applaud you for reminding us about them. And the books, the whole concept of banning diversity is rampant across the nation right now, rewriting history. So it works kind of cyclical, works for us.
Can I just show that I still have my copy of The Dragon and the Doctor? That's for you, Jan. I went and found it when you mentioned it. I actually knew where it was in my house.
Oh, you're funny. You're
Yeah,
funny.
yeah.
I'd love to see it.
Okay,
I
well,
don't have one. I haven't seen one for years.
yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
All right, we have just a thank you to ladies from Monica. She says, I was a student of Sudie's in 1983, a part-time student accountant in training at NCCEO in 1984, a client of the Women's Shelter in 1987, and eventually gave back to News in 2000. I appreciate all you did for me and the stronger woman I am now, raising my 9-year-old daughter at 54. So what a wonderful compliment to all of you. You couldn't ask for a better one, I think. So thank you all for coming tonight. I can't tell you how grateful we are that you came to hear these wonderful authors and activists, feminists speak. It was great to hear your stories. Such a, for me who grew up during the time you were all teaching, it was, and I I was here in the Valley much of that time. It's really kind of cool to see this all